I would like to welcome everyone, the panelists, and also the attendees for this very important session, which is on the future of diplomacy of cyberspace. As countries across the world are developing offensive and even defensive cyber capabilities, there is very lack of consensus in the acceptance of what state behavior in in the cyberspace is and what kind of a risk it poses to the to various states and also the non-state actors. To address this, there have been developments and also promotion of the strategic framework in forums across the world, including the United Nations and also NATO and the Council and various councils and corporations in Europe. In spite of this development, there have been persistent technical threats in cyberspace, which is posed by state and non state actors that have dramatically increased in both sophistication and number. The potential and actual impact of those threats have grown in number. We have with us today our distinguished speakers. I would like to introduce them. Dr. Eugenio Garcia, he's the Deputy Consul General and also the head of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the Consulate General of Brazil in San Francisco. He has joined us from San Francisco, USA. He is a tech diplomat and has also previously served as a senior advisor at the United Nations. We also have with us Dr. Amit Shinaik, who is the postdoc fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he is also the senior fellow at the the Friedman's Cybersecurity Center, and also a professor at the Tel Aviv University. So the session would go like this. So we'll start with an introduction, followed by question and answers. I would like to request the attendees to type their questions in the chat box or the Q&A area. And then we will be going for the final comments. Over to you, Dr. Gracia.
Thank you. Uh, Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind invitation to join this dialogue. I will speak in my individual capacity as an academic researcher rather than as a representative of any government or organization. Looking forward to our discussion today. I think the first question we need to address is what is cyber diplomacy? So very briefly, I mean, you have two different dimensions that are important in cyber diplomacy. First is the use of digital tools and new technological resources for diplomacy by national governments, since diplomats are representatives of nation states. So including the way each Ministry of Foreign Affairs approach cyber issues in their foreign policies to promote their national interests, policies, strategies in the digital domain. And the second dimension is in cyber diplomacy is the subject matter itself. Cyber diplomacy as a field of interactions in cyberspace and everything digital, from internet governance to cybersecurity and the impact of digital technologies in world politics and international relations. And so here the environment is much more complex, and many non-state actors and stakeholders beyond the nation states, they have key roles to play and they exert considerable influence. Multinational and private companies, they are actively engaged in cybersecurity. And there is sometimes confusion with similar terms such as digital diplomacy or e-diplomacy, tech diplomacies, and cyber diplomacy has been closely associated with cybersecurity, which is true, but the implications are wide-ranging. They are cross-border and they have multiple dimensions. So Today, the states need to adapt to this new reality, and traditional concepts of power, sovereignty, territory, which in the past had in mind the physical world, now they have to be understood in a new light, in the realm of the intangible or the invisible nature of cyberspace, if you allow me. But which does, cyberspace doesn't respect geopolitical borders, and it changes the character of traditional diplomacy. So it's a new arena for international interaction. And today, the situation doesn't look good. So there is a growing concern about malicious cyber activities aimed at the critical infrastructure and other facilities supporting essential service to the public. And the impact of these emerging technologies has a security dimension that must be seriously considered to mitigate risks and prevent conflicts. As we know, the internet is an interconnected system of global networks, and the risks of systemic disruption or structural instability, and these risks can't be ignored. So I believe it's in the interest of all states to promote the use of ICTs for peaceful purpose and to prevent conflicts. So the ultimate goal of cyber diplomacy, in my view, should be precisely to bring stability, ensure dialogue, and mitigate cyber conflicts, keeping the channels open for communication among states and other players, despite growing disagreement. So this is when technology meets geopolitics, and that's why the ideological divide between Western liberal democracies and authoritarian governments, like the US and allies versus Russia and China, this is a reason for concern for the future of the internet, precisely due to the risk of fragmentation, or some experts call it balkanization of the internet in separate domains, or splinternet effect. And so the future of cyber diplomacy will depend on how this power struggle evolves in the long term, and how all stakeholders engage and keep their commitment to international cooperation to deal with the challenges ahead. So I'm very glad to be here. And as you know, I'm from Brazil, and Brazil has a long tradition of being very active on internet governance and cyber issues. And Ambassador Guilherme Patriota from Brazil was the chair of the group of governmental experts, the GGE, and the United Nations. And most people probably they don't remember that the last time the GGE achieved a consensus in a report before the current one this year was in 2015, when another Brazilian diplomat, Carlos Perez, was also the chair of the GGE. So maybe it's just a coincidence, but the fact is that the GGE reached a deadlock in 2017. So this report was in 2015. And because of this deadlock, only in 2018, the UN General Assembly established two different processes. One, a Russian draft resolution was adopted in the first committee and created the open-ended working group, the OEWG, which is open to the entire UN membership. And at the same time, a US proposal was approved to establish yet another GGE, comprising 25 members. But we'll have time and the chance to discuss this later. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, sir. Now over to Dr. Shanaik.
So hi everyone. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and this opportunity to express my views. And again, those are my personal, professional views, academic views, and I don't represent here any other organization. Thank you also for the kind and smart opening remarks of my colleague here. I totally agree. I would say that in order to understand what cyber diplomacy is, one have to start by thinking what cyberspace is. What does that mean exactly? And actually, why do we not refer to the term internet diplomacy? We don't refer to the term, hardly to the term internet diplomacy, because there's a tension here between two possible definitions of what it means. We can perceive that cyber is, under the technical definition, ICT, a connection between, sensors and computers, talking about routers, talking about the technical reality which is behind whatever happens on through the internet, whether it's malicious use of the internet or for the better good or whatever it is. And this is part of how we can understand to monitor and to act also in terms of diplomacy. But it's also about the possible other definition of the internet as a cyberspace. Hence, this is a more cultural, invisible, as my colleague said, explanation of what cyber is. States mostly, and we can say that today almost for sure, perceive cyberspace to be another domain almost equal in terms of importance to the physical domains, land and sea and air, and then try to develop their sovereignty and to extend their control also through the means of diplomacy by addressing it as if it's another place, another dimension in which they interact with other states, in which they pursue to achieve their interests. Understanding this way help us to understand that cyberspace is political. As was said here before, it's another arena for the geostrategic reality of the world. Whether an extension of local and regional conflicts or cooperations between states, or whether an extension of an international conflict or friction or competition, as you can see between the United States and China, United States and Russia. The example of the GGE, which was long been addressed and pushed ahead by the United States, as opposed to the open-ended working group, open-ended working group, which is a parallel almost mechanism under the UN, pushed by Russia, is another expression, a diplomatic, multilateral expression of this notion in which cyber is another place in which using diplomacy, it's an extension of pre-existing geostrategic tensions. On the other hand, cyber also holds a few other important components. One, there's a big gap between formalities and agreements and actions to create order by means of ideas about the use of international law to the reality of which states attack each other, in which states attribute attack to other places. There's a conduct here, and now 20 years after the beginning of the surge of cyber attacks, we can say that there's a pre-existing almost norm or way of conduct. It's changing, but it's also the reality of how states and organizations act in cyberspace. Another big important difference is the fact that cyber is not physical. It's not really a domain, a natural domain, but a man-made domain. Hence, people create the internet, and people can change technically how the internet, how ICT are conducted, and implement policy by changing the architecture, the technical architecture of how things are being conducted in ICT, in the communication between computers. This opens up a whole area of possibilities which do not exist. And when you address, the physical domain, such as air or land or sea, you can actually code into the software ideas, ethical ideas. All this, of course, is just a glimpse of why this is such an important arena. And its importance grows day by day, year by year, due to the fact that we are using ICTs for more and more possibilities, for more reasons. The fact that we are actually in the world of Internet of Things, in which other devices are actually online and connected, put a whole emphasis on a big change in that in cyber diplomacy, which would look also on how the private sector plays a role, an important role, because he's actually the one that is in charge on the construction of end devices which can make the internet secure or unsecure. Okay, those are my opening remarks, and I would love to hear your comments.
Thank you so much, sir. So now coming to the questions, which is based on what you just said, I'll come to Dr. Shanaik. So you just mentioned about the political advantage and the technological architecture of cyberspace, which kind of governs the entire cyber diplomacy and what we are discussing today. So my question to you is, what is the difference between the political advantage in cyber and also the technological advantage in cybersecurity?
Well, yeah, thank you for the great question. I would say that my answer here, in a way, I apologize in advance. I want to start with a bit of theory here. As an academic, the world of an aspect of theory that I'm engaged with, which is science, technology, and society, gives a good answer to any question like that. Our tendency as humans to differ between technology, between science, between scientific artifacts and politics, as if those are two different things, separated, as if technology is totally objective and the politics is subjective, is not maybe the right way to go about it. In simple words, what I'm trying to say, there is no difference. Political and technological advantages of cyber goes hand by hand. They are co-produced. And that is why in my open remarks, I talked about policy by design. The internet was made up by people. They coded into the way it's being worked out, into the way how protocols were designed, their perception of the world. Going back to the 80s, the fact that the United States scientists using the domain name system, the system that controls the addresses of the internet, have managed to code into the way we send emails, actually the same international territorial state-based order. There are no virtual states, no virtual places. That did not allow a country or an entity which was not recognized by the UN to be able to obtain a top-level country code domain name, meaning that the same order was coded technically into the internet. This is just another example, an historical example, not very long history, but recent history of how technology advantage and political advantage goes hand by hand. And in a way, this is pushing ahead another factor, the factor that in the big diplomacy or the big interaction between states in regards to cyberspace, there's a big importance of how well do countries cooperate between national and non-national entities. How do they work well with how do they utilize, can they utilize, are they part of the ecosystem? How good is the ecosystem? Ecosystem meaning the ability to transfer knowledge between different stakeholders, between different entities, between the government, between universities, between entrepreneurs, between big international corporations and local startups. Can they together push ahead technologies that will give the country an advantage in terms of being more secure in terms of cyber, being more competent? This is another example of how the technological advantage and the political advantage go hand by hand. And this is actually, the importance of international cooperation was there before the era of cyber or the era of the internet, but it definitely was pushed ahead, it was amplified by the use of ICTs, which give some companies, international companies that holds the control of, for example, computerized infrastructures like 5G or cloud storage abilities. There's only a handful of companies that can provide those services. It gives them the ability to play a very important role. Those companies, if they belong to a certain country, this is another factor that connects between the technical ability that the company holds and the fact that you have a country that has those companies. It gives political and technological advantages, another example, how can they go hand by hand? Hopefully that wasn't too long. I'm sorry for that.
Not at all. That was really, it was absolutely, I think I can go with the next question, which is following what you have just said. So I would like to come to Dr. Garcia. So how do you look at the role of the global south? Because we see that technologically advantaged countries are mostly the countries like the US and also Europe, who are also leading this debate on cyber diplomacy. So, what is, in your view, the role of the global south today?
Thank you. I think first of all, we need to pay more attention, not only capacity building, which is a problem for the developing world, but pay more attention to diversity and inclusion of underrepresented states and stakeholders of the global south. Because as you said, there is no shortage of analysis focusing on great power competition and the struggle for cyber global supremacy, especially US, China, but also Russia, other countries, G7, etc. And the global south is sometimes underrepresented in these debates. And developing countries should not be relegated to the role of spectators or just technology takers. They need to be engaged in this vital conversation. And yeah, I agree with you that the dominance of the political discourse by wealthy and powerful countries, this raises several questions. So will developing countries, low income or middle income countries be represented properly in cyber policy narratives? Will they be able to coordinate their own initiatives? And I believe for cybersecurity governance to be truly global, all interest parties should be engaged in more systematically and have their say. Another point that is important is the role of the global south in multilateral settings, such as the United Nations. I'll give you an example. In 2019, Russia proposed a new global cybercrime treaty. So in a resolution, in the votes of this cybercrime resolution sponsored by Russia and supported by China, some developing countries and emerging technological powers, including Singapore or India, even African countries like Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, they voted yes to support this resolution. And with this vote, the UN General Assembly decided to establish a committee of experts to discuss this international convention on cybercrime. And as we know, the proposed treaty was presented as a more global and inclusive alternative to the Budapest Convention on cybercrime. And the Budapest Convention was never endorsed by Russia and China, but supported by the US and Europe and others. And the United States has been relying in coalitions of like-minded states like the G7, the OECD, or initiatives with other allies, which is like a building block strategy to set the agenda and attract others for norm setting in the cyberspace. In Russia and China, they believe they can successfully push their cyber agenda at the United Nations, joining forces with Global South supporters. So there is a tension between this global struggle and the Global South, because will developing countries take the lead or just be used in some cases as an instrument for this global struggle? So just to finish these comments, it doesn't matter, because developing countries, because they have, of course, several problems in terms of development, that since they should not be relegated to the role of spectators, I think we should think of perhaps suggestions to allow for greater participation in many cases, like multi-stakeholder settings, engage in civil society, or build capacity to empower people and boost cyber stability in the global south as well. So, and seek inputs from neglected audiences and marginalized groups in the global south. Well, I mean, much can be learned from these multidisciplinary perspectives by bringing new voice to the table, either to hear their concerns or to exchange views and explore alternative approaches. And we need to take advantage of multilateralism. The United Nations has experience and convening power to provide this legitimate platform for facilitate negotiations on cybersecurity and include global south countries. But I will stop here. Thank you.
So you touched upon a very important point, and that is the role of the global south. But however, we see that the cyberspace, it does not have any boundaries. So with this, I would like to come to Dr. Shanaik. So what, according to you, is the process of establishing sovereignty in cyberspace? How do we draw the lines on the map?
First of all, I don't know if cyberspace doesn't have borders. The fact that virtual borders, do they exist or not, is a question we should ask. We can definitely say that a border is something which is not just physical, it's also conceptual in a sense. And hence, theoretically it can exist, not that practically it also can exist even in the virtual domain. This answer, I think, require us to say a bit about sovereignty, or the creation of the extension or the expansion of sovereignty of states towards new spaces or contested spaces. And here, I think not enough is being done to learn from the big and the long historical experience of states. How do they expand their sovereignty towards other spaces historically? And you can, if you do that, you can actually see there's a big parallel lines, a lot of parallel lines between what happened, for example, in the creation of, a few hundred years ago, of state sovereignty expansion towards the sea or maritime domain, and how it actually can be sometimes relevant in order to understand how do states assert their sovereignty in the cyber domain. First of all, because states, like any other organization, have an organizational memory. They tend to do the things they did before. What happened today is that in regards to this virtual cyber domain, things happen much more fastly. They advance at a much faster pace, but the trends are a bit similar. There's actions of physical actions of creating borders, delineating borders. And I think the example that I gave before of the domain name system, for example, is an example how you can technically code the software to adhere to the international systems of national borders. There are no virtual states, even though in the 90s, a lot of technical utopianism movement talked about virtual space, places which are free of control of states, free markets, totally free. And this did not happen because immediately this is a technology that was created by states, and it's showing the state's order in it. And there's other ways in terms of routers and cables. There's a physical side of creating borders in cyber. The second part is institutional. And you can see that also historically, institutions such as branches of governments in international organizations which are dealing with cyber. We have the classical organizations like the ITU, new organizations like the GGE, we just mentioned, but also extending your previous notions such as international law, governments and creating erecting specific, offices that are dealing with cyberspace, and de facto, day-to-day, address this domain as if it's a place that needs to be controlled, that needs to be thought of as an extension of the state. Also, in terms of armies with cyber commands, etc., there's a parallel, way or approach institutionally to cyber as if it's an extension of the state. It's another place that you need to assert your sovereignty, even though it is a contested area, as we do in the physical domain. Sometimes we have a place which is less control or has some problems, and we try to assert our sovereignty there. Lastly, there's an ethical or conceptual vision of what sovereignty is. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who is on our side? Who is on the other side? This happens also in cyber, whether ethically, talking about the dark side of cyber, like the dark web or the deep web sometimes, and whether internationally, trying to group countries around a certain perception to create camps of should we not interfere with the content of the internet, for example. This approach of internet content or information sovereignty, which is an approach pushed by Russia and China for many years, and other states today also, and other perceptions. So there's also all these processes, which has long happened in many other places, also do exist in regard to the cyber domain. So I would say that even though we're not in a complete achievement of cyber sovereignty, it is definitely an issue which is thought of, it is acted upon, and it's definitely not a total anarchical space that allows, for example, you spoke about Global South. 15, 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, people thought that cyber will be an asymmetric ability that will give, I would say, less developed countries an ability to compete equally with big states. But that's not the case, because in order to control those man-controlled technologies, usually you need to be an advanced country, and this sometimes mostly fall down on the high-income countries or countries that have a tendency to utilize technology. You can see also a parallel between the nuclear club of the small amount of countries that have a nuclear ability, and those who also have the advanced cyber abilities. So those are definitely, there's a parallels here. All right, thanks.
Thank you, sir. I would like to come with the next question, which is again a follow-up of this question, part of the dialogue, which is on the role of the United Nations. So today, Dr. Garcia, if you could just let us know about the transformation that is currently happening in terms of the role of United Nations, so that Professor Shinai just mentioned in his dialogue that there is the conceptual borders, which is nothing but the domain name servers and all that can be. And sometimes this is highly debatable because many countries were left out from the initial discussions that were happening. Any transformation, how do you see as the role of United Nations so that there can be more inclusion in terms of policy formation and governance? Thank you.
Yeah, just to react to this comment of Dr. Sheniak, because I agree on the issue of borders in cyberspace, because borders as a concept. So I fully agree with Amit on this point, because in our minds, we usually think of the physical world and borders like the Great Wall of China. But what is the Great Firewall of China? So it's another border, but a virtual border. So border as a concept. So we need to adapt our minds to think not only on the physical borders that we are used to, but also the virtual borders that have been created, and we know they have a really everything we discuss about the free flow of information on the internet. So we need to take into account this also virtual / conceptual reality. But going back to the United Nations, yes, in fact, the UN has been playing a leading role in promoting dialogue on these cyber issues, especially under the General Assembly agenda item, developments in the field of information telecommunications in the context of international security. It's a very long agenda item, but this is it is UN language anyway, so we could just translate in regular cybersecurity instead of having all this long agenda item. But this is the way diplomats try to arrange the language to fit the purpose. And the General Assembly, they have two parallel process. I mentioned already the open-ended working group, OEWG, and the group of governmental experts, the GGE, both on cybersecurity. And this is an ongoing effort that obviously has not started from scratch. There is behind it a long story of years of deliberations on cybersecurity in the United Nations, and member states, they have been discussing for over 2 decades how to foster digital cooperation and discussing rules and principles of responsible behavior in cyberspace. In my view, voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior can reduce risks to international peace and security, but over time, we should make efforts to enable binding norms for enhancing stability in the cyberspace. But looking to the future, early this month, we had a new development in New York. In the United States and Russia, they submit a joint draft resolution in the first committee. So, and everybody was surprised. So basically, they welcome the two consensual reports of the OEWG and the DGE. And Russia and the United States, they support the mandate given by member states to the OEWG for the years 2021 until 2025. And by doing so, the US and Russia, they asked for international cooperation and taking advantage of previous reports and recommendations of both OEWG and the DGE. Of course, it's not much. I mean, the draft resolution is mostly on procedure, but what is remarkable is the fact that both countries decide to present this draft resolution together. And this was highly unexpected, since they have been in a collision course for years. So in the past, Russia supported the OEWG, but the US favored the GGE. So this new approach is perhaps the result of their bilateral conversations on cyber issues, because they have this bilateral track, including they have been discussing election interference, ransomware, denial of service attacks, and other cyber attacks. So this is when the bilateral meets the multilateral, because of these bilateral conversations, I believe they were able to present this joint draft resolution in the first committee. And this is very symbolic, but it's positive because they are willing to preserve this multilateral space and the United Nations for these negotiations to happen. And if they are willing to take advantage of the UN to keep the dialogue going and get other actors involved as well, this is positive. And if adopted, because they have just submitted the draft resolution, it could bring also an end to this two-track process, because since 2018, we have both the OEWG and the DGE, which is like sometimes difficult to coordinate, or it's a little bit cumbersome to have two tracks on the same issue, which is cybersecurity. So hopefully this resolution could pave the way for a more constructive environment in the first committee, in the United Nations and beyond.
So what is the role of media giants like Facebook, Google, and various media companies that we have, the apps that we use today? What is their role in terms of cyber diplomacy?
Well, you asking me, right? Yes. No, yes, there is much disagreement among states on what to do next. So lack of progress, negotiations, the risk of deadlock. It seems we are not moving and cyber governance remains fragmented. And for the global tech companies, this is bad for business. So most of these tech giants, they need an open, stable, and secure internet. So this scenario of splinternet I mentioned before would be highly unfortunate for them and for everybody, of course. So that's why, among other reasons, the private sector and other non-state actors, civil society, they have been trying to fill the gap in traditional diplomatic state negotiations. And they have been trying to put forward informal norms or agile structures of cyber governance. And the result is like a mix of initiatives. We have from the industry, Microsoft, they have several initiatives, and they have the report of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, or even multi-stakeholder proposal, the Paris Call, for instance. So what we see is the big tech, they are much more active to enhance cybersecurity through voluntary and soft law initiatives, or they will face very negative alternatives, including forceful regulation or growing data localization. Again, the border problem of the internet. And they could be facing more barriers imposed by states against the free flow of information. So this is, of course, it's an evolving situation. But my second point is there is a need for public-private coordination in cyber defense. So the question expert I ask is as follows: should private companies be responsible for national security? And many companies, they claim they cannot be the ones bearing the cost of cyber defense because this is a matter for the states, it's for the government. The government should be responsible to protect the nation against hackers and cyber attacks. But then the state or the government would say, hey, you need to give me the information. We need to know if and when you are under attack so that we can respond. But this is, of course, not easy. So as a matter of fact, private companies, they don't want to spend millions of dollars in cybersecurity. And this is another contradiction because we know cyber attacks happen every day, but the budget for cybersecurity is still low everywhere. So some sort of public-private coordination is necessary. And at the international level, this is what we call multi-stakeholderism. Everyone is on the same boat. So you can't rock the boats because we will also suffer the consequence. I'll stop here.
Thank you, sir. That was really interesting. Coming to the next question, Professor, I would like to ask you, like you just spoke about asymmetric warfare and you spoke about diplomacy, but it looks very bleak because of various institutions and how they are just playing up in cyberspace. So just to get some clarity, what is the difference between cyber war and cyber diplomacy? And which institution or entity has most control in the age of the internet? Because today we see that it's quite bleak in terms of many countries. They are very they think that cyber war and they have to have their own capabilities development but where does it fall? How does, just to get some clarity on the whole picture?
First of all, again, we are on a shoestring here, touching huge subjects that are hard to explain. I mean, there used to be, and there is a huge debate whether cyber war is something that is in the future. Did it already happen? Will it ever happen or not? I would say this is until define what war is. I don't want to get into that. I would say that it's that maybe if I can reshape or rephrase your question, it's about the different kinds of power in cyber. And I would use the work of giants like Joseph Nye, who talked about the possibilities for soft power and hard power. And he also wrote his famous book, The Future of Power, and a translation of that concept into the world of cyber. And I think referring to what our colleagues, my colleague here before said, which I thought was great, we can see both happening in this domain as they do in other domains as well. We have the soft power capabilities, which include diplomacy, but also are, about the projection of economical power. I mentioned before, if Amazon is in your country, then you have a lot of power using it in the cyber world because, eventually this is an American company and it allows power. It's part of the power that you possess, and there's many other stuff. But also, on the other hand, there's hard power, the use of, cyber or the internet or ICT in order to inflict harm in a more classical way, whether as part of a war, as part of espionage, with attribution, without attribution. I don't want to get into those big issues, which are very important. I would say that eventually Joseph Nye, and I think this happens also today, goes back to what my colleagues describe as the new achievement in terms of cyber diplomacy, which is that new joint Russian-American resolution, as opposed to the conflict or the two parallel tracks, the open-ended working group and the GGE beforehand, is that we can see a mixture of, both hard power and soft power, what we call smart power. It's definitely an example. I mean, some people would say, it's very cynical how Russia and China and other, would push ahead, or the United States would push ahead international norms, processes, and the extension of legal framework to address cybersecurity, but on the other hand, would engage in cyber espionage and will do things that are attributed to them, which are on their other side. They do both. The world is complex and things happen jointly. On the other hand, and I think that's very important, the role of the big corporations, the multi-stakeholder approach that was mentioned before, and I also talked about it before, is something which is very relevant in that setting. We have today a new era in which, let me go backwards. Sovereignty sometimes is defined as, the control of a state of violence. This is the basic essence of sovereignty of states. The execution of organized violence is only by states. And you have, of course, organizations who are trying to undermine that, terrorist organizations, big international criminal organizations, et cetera, et cetera. We have an example here today of those companies, in a way, for the first time, that are holding part of the answer to better the security of the internet, or to prevent cyber war, if you would like. Whether it's because they are holding a big part of the hardware and the software, it's hard for state to monitor the threat without working hand by hand with giants, technical giants like Google and Siemens and others. And those companies, on the other hand, are dependent on international order in order to continue and to thrive. We have many examples of that. Some of them were mentioned here before. We have diplomatic actions done by corporations like Microsoft, Tech Accords and Digital Geneva, Siemens Charter of Trust, and many others. But we also have companies that do, in a way, take law or take the matter of law into their hands. Whether it's Google's Zero project, in which they would investigate a poorly secured website and penalty whoever owns the website by themselves. Whether it's just by providing services, and for example, there's a big issue about cyber insurance. I know you're going to address that in your part of your talks here in the Cyber Diplomat. I would say all this, in a way, translate to the big questions of cyber war and cyber diplomacy by saying differentiating between the two is maybe not that would not serve us well. It's better for us to see things in a more complex way, in which we have both actions of diplomacy, of creating international law, which is customary, actions of states' conduct, whether by inflicting harms or by doing things under the threshold or above it, actions which are done by non-state actors, cases in which they work together. The complexity of the world which pre-existed cyber is intensified in cyber. And I think this is a much better and more realistic way of perceiving these big questions about whether we will see cyber war or not. And without going into the big debate whether this is real war or just another act of violence. No, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we just come to the last part. Any comments that you have regarding this discussion was very insightful. Too many points that were made, especially regarding cyber diplomacy, about how everything plays up. And these questions, it was framed based on your research, which I would like to recommend everybody go and read these research papers and articles written by both of you, which is just amazing because it clearly puts the big picture in place. So I would like to come to the final comments. Dr. Gracia, over to you.
Yes, thank you. We've been talking about the subject matter. It's the second dimension I mentioned in the beginning of the cyber diplomacy. The second, which is cyber diplomacy itself, but thinking about digital technology as a tool for cyber diplomacy and how diplomats use them in cyber diplomacy. I believe we are now living in a COVID-19 paradox. We are closer online, but further apart in the real world, so in the physical world, because in many ways, so we now have all these new technologies to engage more people, more webinars and dialogues like this one, more opportunities to connect. But when you look at international politics today, what we see is fragmentation, mistrust, there's ideological divide, polarization, geopolitical tensions. We are not united or closer together. So there is a crisis of confidence in international institutions. So to manage these divisions, we need more diplomacy, not less. And the problem is about the future. First, human nature didn't change. So human needs remain the same. Cyber diplomacy as a tool is yet another channel to deal with human problems at international level. Because when we see the discussion on virtual diplomacy, some people say that it's completely different because we cannot read the room, and we have Zoom meetings that diplomats will complain that diplomacy is about confidentiality, and this environment is not secure, and they can just if the event is recorded, they cannot really speak as privately as would be required if they want to reach an agreement with the other players. So I think in the future we'll see, despite COVID-19, this new reality of cyber diplomacy as a tool, and diplomats need to catch up. You know? So I see a hybrid future. Online meetings will become routine work and for specific tasks, and this online meetings will continue, of course. This will avoid unnecessary time-consuming long-distance travel. And face-to-face negotiations will be reserved for hard issues or key decisions to be made. So it's a matter of combining the best of both worlds, the virtual and the physical world. So going online whenever possible and travel only when you need it, and time management to better use of resources. So in the meantime, engage more with all the resources we have right now. So just to conclude, I think going back now to cyber diplomacy as the subject matter, in my view, do no harm should be the first and foremost principle governing the internet. But to make it a reality, all states and stakeholders in the digital domain, they should refrain from malicious activities contrary to international law. Rather, they should take steps to further exchange information, secure service, improve collaboration. It's not easy to do so, but this is the challenge, and that's why we need diplomacy. So I hope a sense of shared responsibility and collective engagement will guide the major players in this critical area for stability and security in cyberspace and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Shanaik. Sir, you're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry for that. Thanks again for inviting me, and thanks for this opportunity. Also, thank you for the interesting and smart comments made by my colleague here. I feel I don't have much to add. I will try to add just two things to the good concluding sentences of my colleague here. I would say, first of all, the fact that we actually have cyber diplomacy, that we have people working for foreign offices and people working for international organizations whose their job is cyber, thinking whether to promote, order or norms, is something which is, 10 years ago wasn't that, it wasn't that clear, but 20 years ago that we will achieve to that point. And now it's a reality in a way, even though we're not there yet, and we've talked enough about, the different challenges that we're facing in this field. It's definitely a good sign of the fact that the world order and cyber are in interaction here. And there's an expansion, there's a willingness of states, of non-state actors to create some kind of an order. So the existence of cyber diplomacy as a field, the fact that we have a webinar on it means something, and this should not take it for granted. I'm telling you, 10 years ago, this would have been pretty, sound pretty odd. And not a lot of people were working on cyber diplomacy as they do today. Also, adding to the great description of the hybrid world that was described here, I totally agree. I would just add that it's not just the means of communication, cyber or data that is produced by ICTs is also the base for AI, for artificial intelligence. And I'm posing a question here, and whether that hybrid world would also include, diplomatic AI abilities, analyzing, virtual talks, analyzing mimics of faces, analyzing different stuff, and advising, machine advisement, advising, diplomats what kind of course of action they should take, is another possible, future. Unfortunately, not that far from where we are today, because this field is advancing very fast. And we might actually meet again in a couple of years on a webinar called AI and Diplomacy. And this should probably happen soon. Thank you so much again, and thank you for the invitation and the kind words.
Thank you so much for this. I would like to thank our panelists, also the attendees for this particular attendance and for this dialogue that we are having today. I absolutely agree with what both of you just told about the hybrid warfare and also about artificial intelligence and how how the future is going to be like. And it's something to be researched, and still there is a lot of clarity that is still that we need to get in terms of the big picture and how governance must be like. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
See
you.
you next time.
See you. Bye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all again.
See you.
See you next time. Thanks you. Bye bye.
See you. Bye-bye. See you.